The sound of shattered glass echoed through the empty practice room. "Why can't you be more like Hyunjin?" The words weren't spoken by a stranger. They came from someone Felix trusted. For a brief second, everything seemed to stop. The music that had been playing from the speakers faded into meaningless noise. The fluorescent lights above flickered softly, casting pale reflections across the broken mirror lying on the floor. Felix stood motionless. His breathing grew shallow. The person who had spoken looked instantly regretful, but the damage had already been done. Because this wasn't the first time Felix had heard those words. Not this week, not this month, and certainly not this year. The comparison had started quietly. At first, it appeared in harmless comments online, people discussing performances, people ranking talents, people debating who worked harder, who danced better, who attracted more attention, who deserved more recognition. Most of the members ignored it. They had grown accustomed to public opinions, but comparisons were different. Comparisons planted seeds, and seeds always grew, especially when repeated often enough. Felix bent down and carefully picked up a piece of broken glass from the floor. His reflection stared back from the jagged surface, distorted, fragmented, almost unrecognizable. For some reason, that reflection felt honest, because lately, that was exactly how he felt inside. Broken into pieces by expectations he never asked for. Outside the practice room, footsteps hurried away. The person who had spoken couldn't bear to stay. Felix remained alone. Silence wrapped around him like cold fog. His phone vibrated. He already knew who it was before looking. Hyunjin. The screen displayed a simple message. "Where are you?" Felix stared at it for several seconds. Normally, he would answer immediately. Tonight, he couldn't. Not because he was angry. Not because he blamed Hyunjin, but because he was afraid. Afraid that if he looked into Hyunjin's eyes right now, he would see pity. And pity was worse than criticism, much worse. He placed the phone face down, the vibration stopped. Then came another message and another, and another. Hyunjin never gave up easily. That was one of the things Felix admired most about him. A weak laugh escaped Felix's lips. Even now, he couldn't bring himself to resent his friend. That was the problem. Hyunjin had done nothing wrong, yet somehow he was standing at the center of every wound. The comparison wasn't Hyunjin's fault, but it followed him everywhere. Like a shadow neither of them could escape. Hours later, rain fell heavily over the city. The streets glistened beneath neon signs and blurred headlights. Felix walked alone beneath a black umbrella. The cold air carried the scent of wet asphalt. His hood covered most of his face. He wanted anonymity. He wanted distance. Most of all, he wanted silence. Instead, he found Hyunjin standing outside a small convenience store waiting, as if he had known exactly where Felix would go. Hyunjin looked exhausted. His dark hair was damp from the rain. Concern filled his eyes. "You ignored all my messages." Felix looked away. "Fine. Never say that when you're actually fine." Answer came immediately, too immediately, because Hyunjin knew him, maybe better than anyone. For a moment neither spoke. Cars passed. Rain drummed against metal rooftops. The city continued moving around them. Yet time felt frozen. Hyunjin stepped closer. "What happened?" Felix tightened his grip on the umbrella. "Nothing." Felix' name carried years of friendship, years of trust, years of shared dreams, and somehow that made everything harder. Because Felix wanted to tell him, he wanted to admit how exhausted he felt, how every comparison felt like another weight on his shoulders, how every compliment directed toward Hyunjin somehow became criticism aimed at him. But saying those words aloud would make them real, so instead he smiled, a practiced smile, one he had perfected over the years. "I'm just tired." Hyunjin studied him carefully, too carefully, as if searching for cracks, as if sensing the truth hidden beneath the surface. Finally he sighed. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Something twisted painfully inside Felix's chest. Because those were exactly the words he needed to hear, and exactly the words he wasn't ready to accept. The following days only made things worse. Articles appeared online, videos, comment sections, polls, comparisons everywhere. Some praised Hyunjin, others defended Felix. Many treated them like competitors instead of friends. People analyzed every interaction, every glance, every performance, every smile, every silence. The internet transformed their friendship into a battlefield. Neither had volunteered for the war, yet both were forced to fight in it. One evening, after another exhausting schedule, Hyunjin sat alone in the dorm living room. The television played quietly in the background. No one was watching it. His attention remained fixed on his phone. The endless comments scrolled before him. He hated himself for reading them, yet he couldn't stop. One comment caught his eye. "Felix deserves better friends." His stomach tightened. Another appeared. Hyunjin only shines because Felix lets him. Then another, they secretly hate each other, and another, just admit Hyunjin is better. The words blurred together, thousands of strangers pretending to understand lives they had never lived. Hyunjin locked the screen. His reflection appeared in the dark glass, tired, frustrated, lost. For the first time, he wondered whether the comparisons were hurting Felix more than anyone realized. The thought terrified him, because he knew Felix. He knew how often Felix smiled through pain, how often he hid struggles behind kindness, how often he protected others while neglecting himself. A sudden memory surfaced. Years ago, two trainees sitting on a rooftop beneath a sky filled with stars, both uncertain about the future, both terrified of failure. Back then they had made a promise: no matter what happened, no matter how successful they became, no matter how difficult things got, they would never let fame destroy their friendship. At the time, the promise had seemed simple. Now it felt impossible. The next morning arrived with grey skies and heavy clouds. Felix stood before another mirror. This one remained unbroken. Yet the reflection still felt wrong. He stared at himself. Not the image others saw, not the performer, not the public figure, just himself. The person hidden beneath expectations, the person beneath comparisons, the person beneath years of pressure. For the first time in a long while, he asked a question he had been avoiding. Who am I when nobody is comparing me to someone else? The answer never came, only silence, heavy, endless, and frightening. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the sky. A storm was coming, not just above the city, but between perceptions and reality, between public opinion and private truth, between two friends trying desperately to protect something precious from a world determined to measure, rank, and compare everything. Neither Felix nor Hyunjin knew how difficult the coming days would become. Neither understood how deeply the comparisons had already rooted themselves inside their hearts, but both could feel it: the tension, the uncertainty, the invisible fracture spreading beneath the surface. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows, beyond the flashing cameras and endless opinions, their friendship stood quietly at a crossroads, still standing, still strong, yet carrying wounds neither had fully acknowledged. Wounds that would soon demand to be faced. The storm arrived before sunset. Dark clouds swallowed the horizon, turning the city into a landscape of shadows and silver rain. Water streamed down the glass walls of the company building, blurring the lights outside into streaks of gold and white. Inside a rehearsal studio, Felix sat alone on the floor. His headphones rested around his neck. The music had stopped minutes ago, yet he remained there, staring at nothing. His body was present. His mind was somewhere else entirely. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and sweat from hours of practice. Normally, dancing helped him think. Today it only made the noise louder, not the music, the voices, the comments, the comparisons, the endless opinions of people who believed they understood him. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Felix didn't answer. The door opened anyway. Hyunjin stepped inside. Neither spoke immediately. The tension between them wasn't anger. That would have been easier. Instead, it was uncertainty, a strange distance neither knew how to cross. Hyunjin closed the door behind him. You skipped lunch, Felix shrugged. I wasn't hungry. You skipped dinner yesterday too. Still no eye contact, still no smile. Hyunjin's concern deepened. The silence stretched longer. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Felix spoke. Do you ever get tired? Hyunjin blinked. Tired of what? Felix laughed softly. The sound carried no amusement. Tired of being compared to someone. Understanding flashed across Hyunjin's face, immediately, painfully, because he knew exactly what Felix meant. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls themselves were listening. Hyunjin moved closer. Answer. Interruption surprised both of them. Felix rarely cut people off, especially Hyunjin. For a brief moment guilt crossed his face, but the words kept coming. Do you ever wonder if people only see us as numbers? Hyunjin remained silent. Better dancer. Felix looked down. Better performer. His fingers tightened around a water bottle. Better personality. Plastic crinkled. Better friend. His voice grew quieter. Better everything. The last words barely escaped. Hyunjin stood frozen, because beneath those sentences was something far deeper. Fear, not jealousy, not resentment. Fear of being reduced to a comparison. Fear of never being enough. Fear of losing himself. Hyunjin slowly sat beside him. Neither looked at the other. For a while they simply listened to the rain. Then Hyunjin finally spoke. Hate it too. Felix turned. For the first time that day their eyes met, and Felix saw something unexpected. Exhaustion, real exhaustion, the kind people rarely noticed, the kind hidden behind confidence. Hyunjin stared at the floor. You think those comments don't affect me? His voice was calm, too calm. Every time someone says I'm better than you, I feel guilty. Felix's expression shifted. Hyunjin continued. Every time someone says you're better than me, I start wondering if I'm failing. Confession hung heavily between them, raw, honest, painful. Neither had spoken these thoughts aloud before, perhaps because they were afraid, perhaps because acknowledging them made them real. Hyunjin leaned back against the mirrored wall. I keep thinking that if I work harder, people will stop comparing us. A bitter smile appeared. They never do. Felix looked away, because he understood perfectly. For years they had been fighting different battles against the same enemy, an enemy with no face, no name, no physical form, an expectation, a comparison, a narrative created by strangers, and somehow it hurt both of them, more than either had admitted. The following week became increasingly difficult. Interviews, schedules, appearances. The pressure never stopped. Neither did the comparisons. One afternoon, the members gathered for a promotional shoot. Bright studio lights illuminated the set. Staff members moved quickly between cameras and equipment. Everything appeared normal, until a reporter asked a seemingly innocent question. If you had to choose, who do you think stands out more between Felix and Hyunjin? The room fell silent instantly, a silence so sudden it felt violent. The smile disappeared from Felix's face. Hyunjin's jaw tightened. Several staff members exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even the reporter realized the mistake. Too late. The question had already landed. Like a stone thrown into still water, its ripples spread everywhere. For one endless second nobody spoke. Then Hyunjin answered, his voice steady, controlled. There is no competition. Reporter looked surprised. Hyunjin continued. People always ask who shines brighter. His eyes briefly moved toward Felix. But stars don't compete with each other. Room remained quiet. They shine together. No one spoke after that, not the reporter, not the staff. Not even the cameras seemed capable of interrupting the moment. Felix looked down, suddenly unable to trust his own emotions, because hearing those words hurt, not in a bad way, in a way that reminded him how much he had been carrying alone. That night they returned to the dorm exhausted. Most of the members headed directly to their rooms. The hallways were unusually quiet. Felix stepped onto the balcony. The rain had finally stopped. Cool air brushed against his skin. Above him, clouds drifted slowly across the night sky. The city sparkled below, countless lights stretching into the distance. The balcony door opened. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew. Hyunjin joined him. For several minutes neither spoke. Comfortable silence. The kind only close friends understand. Then Hyunjin suddenly laughed. A genuine laugh, the first in days. Felix raised an eyebrow. What? Hyunjin shook his head. I was remembering something. What? The rooftop. Felix immediately knew. Years ago, 2 trainees, a promise beneath the stars, a future neither could see. A smile appeared despite himself. I remember. Hyunjin looked toward the sky. We were so dramatic. Felix laughed. We still are. That earned another laugh, a real one, the kind that eased tension. For the first time in weeks, the invisible distance between them began to disappear. Not completely. The wounds were still there. The pressure remained. The comparisons hadn't magically vanished. But something important had changed. They had finally started talking, honestly, openly, without hiding behind smiles, and that mattered more than either realized. As the city lights flickered below, Felix felt something unfamiliar, relief, not because the problem was solved, but because he no longer carried it alone. Beside him, Hyunjin leaned against the railing. The wind gently moved his hair. For a moment everything felt peaceful, simple, almost normal. Neither noticed the glowing screen hidden behind a nearby curtain. Inside the dorm, on a table, a phone buzzed quietly. A new article had just been published. An article already spreading rapidly across social media. An article filled with rumors, speculation, and claims that threatened to undo the fragile peace. Felix and Hyunjin had finally begun rebuilding. Neither of them knew it yet. But somewhere online, a new storm was already beginning.
The next morning began with an uneasy silence. Sunlight filtered through the dorm windows, but the warmth it usually brought felt strangely absent. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the building itself sensed something was wrong. Felix woke to the vibration of his phone. Once, twice, 3 times, then dozens more. His eyes narrowed. Notifications flooded the screen, messages, mentions, articles, comments. His stomach tightened before he even opened anything. A feeling deep inside warned him. Something had happened. Slowly, he tapped one of the links. The headline appeared, large, bold, impossible to ignore. It claimed there was tension between him and Hyunjin. It suggested years of friendship had become a hidden rivalry. It analyzed old videos, harmless interactions, and ordinary moments as evidence. Article presented assumptions as facts, speculation as truth, and people were believing it. Felix stared at the screen. His chest felt heavy, not because he believed the article, but because he knew thousands of others would, maybe millions. The phone slipped from his hand onto the bed. For several seconds he simply sat there, motionless. Then came a knock, 3 quick taps. Hyunjin, Felix already knew. "Come in." Door opened immediately. Hyunjin looked exhausted. Dark circles lingered beneath his eyes. He clearly hadn't slept much. Neither of them mentioned the article, not at first. They didn't need to. Both already knew. Both had already read it. The silence said enough. Finally, Hyunjin sighed. "I guess today's going to be fun." The sarcasm was obvious. Felix managed a weak laugh. "Yeah." For a moment they simply looked at each other. And despite everything, there was reassurance in that glance, because no article could erase years of friendship. No rumor could rewrite reality. Yet reality and public perception were not always the same thing. And that was the dangerous part. Hours later, they arrived at the company building. The atmosphere was different, subtle, but noticeable. People spoke more quietly. Staff members checked their phones more often. Managers looked concerned. Everyone was aware of the situation. Nobody wanted to discuss it openly. Inside a meeting room, several executives reviewed reports displayed on large screens, graphs, statistics, online trends. The article was spreading faster than expected. Felix sat near the end of the table. Hyunjin sat beside him. Neither spoke much. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, everyone agreed on one thing. The rumors would eventually fade, but only if they weren't given additional fuel. The advice was simple. Stay calm, stay professional, avoid responding emotionally. In theory, it sounded easy. In reality, it felt impossible, especially when every notification carried another comparison, another assumption, another stranger claiming to understand their lives. That evening, after practice, Felix found himself wandering through an empty hallway. The building was unusually quiet. Most people had already gone home. Only distant sounds echoed from other floors. He stopped beside a large window overlooking the city. Below, traffic moved like rivers of light. For a while he watched silently, then a voice spoke behind him. "Been thinking too much." Felix smiled faintly. Only one person would say that. Without turning around, he replied, "And you've been worrying too much." Hyunjin laughed. "Fair." He joined him by the window. Together they watched the city. The familiar comfort returned, not because things were fixed, but because they understood each other, perhaps better than anyone else could. After several minutes, Hyunjin spoke again. "I ask you something?" Felix nodded. "Sure." Hyunjin hesitated, an unusual sight. Normally he spoke with confidence. Today was different. "Have you ever been angry at me?" The question surprised Felix. He turned immediately. Hyunjin stared at the city lights, avoiding eye contact, almost nervous. Felix considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. "No." Hyunjin finally looked at him. "Never." Felix smiled. "Annoyed sometimes." That earned a small laugh. "But angry? Number." Answer seemed to ease something inside Hyunjin, a burden he had been carrying quietly because the truth was simple. Hyunjin had blamed himself, not entirely, but enough. Every comparison, every rumor, every headline, part of him feared he was somehow responsible for Felix's pain. Hearing otherwise mattered more than he expected. "You?" Felix asked. Hyunjin shook his head immediately. "No." Then he laughed softly. "Sometimes." Now both were laughing. The tension eased further, the kind of healing that happened through honesty rather than grand gestures. As night deepened, they eventually returned to the dorm. Most of the lights were already off. The members had gone to bed. Only the faint glow of a lamp illuminated the living room. Felix paused near a bookshelf. Something caught his attention. A dusty photo frame. One he hadn't looked at in years. He picked it up. The picture showed younger versions of themselves, trainees. Exhausted, smiling, dreaming, long before articles, long before comparisons, long before fame complicated everything. Hyunjin noticed the photo and walked over. For several moments they stared at it together. Neither spoke. Words weren't necessary. The image itself carried countless memories, late-night practices, shared meals, failures, victories, moments nobody else had witnessed, moments that built a friendship stronger than public opinion. Hyunjin eventually smiled. "We looked terrible." Felix laughed. "You looked worse." "Impossible." "It was impressive, actually." Laughter echoed softly through the quiet room, genuine, unforced, real. For the first time in days, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed, lights flickered. People discussed rumors online. The world remained noisy. But inside the dorm, peace slowly returned. Not because the rumors had disappeared, not because the comparisons had ended, but because Felix and Hyunjin had remembered something important. Their friendship had never been built on public approval. It had been built on trust, and trust survived storms. The following morning brought clear skies, sunlight poured through the windows. The rain clouds were gone. For the first time in weeks, the world seemed brighter. Felix stepped onto the balcony carrying a cup of coffee. The cool morning breeze greeted him. Moments later, Hyunjin joined him. Neither spoke immediately. They simply enjoyed the silence. The city stretched endlessly before them, beautiful, calm, full of possibility. And for a brief moment, it felt as though the worst had passed. Neither knew what challenges awaited in the future. Neither knew what new rumors or pressures might appear. But one thing had become undeniable. The comparisons had tested them. The rumors had challenged them. The pressure had wounded them. Yet through it all, their friendship remained standing, not perfect, not untouched, but stronger. Because true friendship is not proven during easy times. It is revealed during difficult ones. And as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, Felix and Hyunjin quietly realized that no matter how loudly the world compared them, no comparison could ever measure what they had built together. Several days passed with an unusual sense of calm. The rumors that had dominated headlines began to lose momentum. New topics captured public attention, and the endless stream of comparisons gradually faded into the background. At least, that was how it appeared from the outside. Inside, some wounds were still healing. Not because Felix and Hyunjin doubted each other. They didn't. The trust between them had survived far worse than internet speculation. But surviving pressure and recovering from pressure were not the same thing. Some scars remained invisible. One afternoon, the group traveled to a coastal city for a special performance. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a pale blue sky. Salt carried through the breeze. Seagulls circled overhead. For most people, it was a beautiful day. For Felix, it felt strangely nostalgic. The scent of the sea always reminded him of simpler times, before expectations became so heavy, before every action felt observed, before every friendship became public property. The venue stood near the shoreline. From backstage, the distant roar of waves mixed with the sounds of preparation. Staff hurried between equipment, lights were tested, cameras adjusted, performers rehearsed. Everything moved with organized chaos. Felix sat quietly near a dressing room mirror. His fingers turned a silver ring absent-mindedly, a habit he had whenever he was deep in thought. Across the room, Hyunjin was reviewing choreography notes. Every so often, their eyes met. Small smiles followed, the kind that required no explanation, the kind built over years. As performance time approached, excitement filled the air. The audience outside grew louder. Thousands of voices merged into a single thunderous sound. Energy crackled through the venue. Yet amid all the noise, something unexpected happened. One of the younger staff members entered carrying a stack of printed fan letters. The tradition wasn't unusual. Sometimes performers received messages before shows, words of encouragement, expressions of support, small reminders of why they worked so hard. The letters were distributed. Most contained warm messages. Some were funny, others emotional. Felix opened one at random. His smile faded, not completely, but enough. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. The message wasn't hateful. In some ways, that made it worse. It simply said, "I hope one day you can become as confident and perfect as Hyunjin." The words were meant as praise. The writer likely had good intentions. Yet once again, comparison had found its way into a place where it didn't belong. Felix folded the letter carefully. His expression remained calm, but Hyunjin noticed. He always noticed. Minutes later, while everyone else prepared for the performance, Hyunjin quietly sat beside him. Neither spoke immediately. The sounds of activity filled the room. Eventually, Hyunjin glanced toward the folded paper. "Another one," Felix nodded. A brief silence followed, then Hyunjin sighed. "I wish people understood." "Understood what?" Hyunjin looked toward the floor. "That compliments don't need comparisons." Answer lingered, simple, yet painfully true. Felix stared at the letter, then slowly smiled. A genuine smile, because Hyunjin had somehow summarized years of frustration in a single sentence. A few hours later, the performance began. Lights exploded across the stage. Music thundered through massive speakers. The crowd erupted. The energy was overwhelming, electric. Thousands of lights swayed like stars. From the stage, the audience looked endless, a living ocean stretching into darkness. Felix felt the familiar rush, the nervousness, the excitement, the joy. For a while, everything else disappeared. No rumors. No articles, no comparisons, only music, only movement. only the connection between performers and fans. And for those precious moments, that was enough. After the show ended, applause continued long after the final song. The audience refused to stop cheering. Many performers became emotional. Even some staff wiped away tears. It had been one of their strongest performances of the year. As the venue slowly emptied, Felix found himself wandering toward the shoreline. The night air felt cool against his skin. The ocean reflected moonlight like liquid silver. Far behind him, distant voices echoed from the venue. Ahead, only waves and silence, the kind of silence he had missed. Footsteps approached. Predictably, Hyunjin. Felix didn't need to look. "You really like disappearing, don't you?" Felix laughed. "You always find me anyway." "That's because your hiding places are terrible." Another laugh. The ocean breeze carried it away. For several minutes they walked along the shoreline. Their shoes sank slightly into wet sand. Waves rolled in and retreated. The rhythm felt calming, almost therapeutic. Eventually they stopped near a cluster of dark rocks. The city lights glowed faintly in the distance. Above them, stars filled the sky, not many, but enough. Hyunjin looked upward. "When we were trainees, I thought success would solve everything." Felix smiled softly. "I remember." "Was stupid." "You still are," Hyunjin groaned. "Thanks." Their laughter returned, easy, natural. Then Hyunjin's expression became thoughtful. "Back then I thought if we worked hard enough, we'd eventually stop worrying." Felix followed his gaze toward the stars. "And now?" Hyunjin considered the question, then answered honestly. "Now I think worrying never disappears." Wind moved through the rocks, soft, gentle. "Maybe you just learn what's worth worrying about." Felix reflected on those words. They felt important, because so much of the last few months had been spent worrying about things outside their control: opinions, comparisons, rumors, narratives. Perhaps none of those deserved so much power. Perhaps what mattered was standing beside the people who truly knew you, the people who remained when headlines disappeared, the people who stayed. The thought settled quietly inside him, comfortably, like a puzzle piece finding its place. Hours later, they finally returned to the hotel. Most of the group was already asleep. The hallways were dim and silent. Before entering their rooms, Hyunjin paused. "So," Felix looked at him. "So," Hyunjin smiled. "We survived another disaster." Felix laughed. "That wasn't a disaster. It was close." "You're dramatic. You said that before." "Because it's true." Both smiled, then Hyunjin raised a hand in farewell. "Good night." Night. The doors closed. The hallway became quiet once more. Inside his room, Felix walked toward the window. The ocean remained visible in the distance, dark, endless, peaceful. For the first time in a long while, his thoughts felt clear, not perfect, not completely free from doubt, but clearer. And that felt like progress. As he watched moonlight shimmer across the water, a realization slowly formed. People would probably continue comparing them, perhaps forever. That was a reality neither could control. But friendship was not defined by outside voices. It was defined by the people living it. And no matter how many comparisons appeared, no matter how many opinions filled the world, nobody else had the authority to decide what their friendship meant. That choice belonged only to them. With that thought, Felix finally stepped away from the window. Outside, waves continued their endless journey beneath the stars. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a new chapter of their lives quietly waited to begin.